As I based my product on existing products in the media, I used many conventions of a typical magazine. This includes using a similar layout for the plug, puff, skyline, barcode, issue information, and page numbers. I also based the positioning of my images on my contents page and double page spread on this product. I also matched the colour scheme of my double page spread to the colours of my front cover, as existing media products do this to give their products a sense of consistency. On my double page spread, I used conventions such as equal column lengths, but I developed this on the second page and divided the page into 2 columns as opposed to 3. This was purely because it made the layout of the page fit together better and allowed the text for the columns to look less crowded. I also used conventions of real media products in terms of using prominence to address my target audience. I mentioned well-established artists like Crystal Castles and The Prodigy to make this product more appealing. Also, by adding a promotional CD to my product, I was using forms of real media products. What my product and Mixmag has in common is that they challenge conventions as a whole. This is because the electronic music genre belongs to almost a niche market in terms of its place within the magazine industry. Because of this, our genre rely more on the content of our products rather than the images and the visuals. For my product, the images were a mixture of males and females. I chose this layout as it would appeal to a wider market as opposed to primarily males or vice versa. In terms of mise-en-scène, the lighting in many of the images were colourful and vivid. This represents the clubber stereotype. Props such as balloons, bottles of alcohol, DJ equipment and glow sticks connotate parties and entertainment, which is ideological of the clubber demographic. Chosen fronts represent a young social group. Throughout my magazine, I used a serif font for various features such as the masthead, headlines and various titles. This is representational of younger social groups, as it strays away from traditionalism. The bright colour scheme I've chosen also represents this particular demographic. In terms of ethnicity, the majority of my images represent a Caucasian ethnicity. The distribution of my magazine is based completely on the genre of my product. This product falls into a somewhat niche market. For my market research, I asked 20 people what music magazine they're most likely to read. Only 13% of the results chose a product similar to mine, whereas 23 to 32 people chose a magazine of the rock or indie genre. Hence the distribution of my product not being suitable for supermarkets. However, institutions like general music stores such as HMV and shops like newsagents would be ideal for the retail of my product. Also, an independent media company within the UK might distribute my product. Mixmag, for example, is distributed by Development Hell Limited. An institution such as this would be ideal for the distribution of my product. Not only do they distribute the existing products that are similar to my genre, but they also supply some of the institutions listed above. They are also in a conglomerate with the world's biggest clubbing social network. This kind of advertising will result in my product appealing to a wider range of potential consumers. In case of marketing, this will also boost my product's readership because more people could hear about it, as online marketing is effective in attracting a particular audience. This would also give people the chance to buy my products online, hence attracting an audience that is already somewhat interested in my product. Also, this institution is already established within this particular media market. I based the ideology of my media product on the results of my market research and general stereotypes that are associated with my chosen genre. Research says that my target age group will be teenagers to young adults. In terms of ethnicity, the electronic music genre has no associated ethnicity to target, as opposed to other genres such as R&B that would mainly target a black audience, as the majority of the artists associated with this genre fits into the ethnicity group. The same stereotype applies to gender, in addition to the market research being inconclusive. Although I have not researched into this when doing my market research, stereotypically my target audience in terms of class would be people of the working to middle class. Because of my chosen genre, I wanted my images to mainly be what attracts my audience. Props such as bottles of alcohol, glow sticks and balloons were used as they stereotypically appeal to the younger audience, as well as further representing the electronic music genre. Lighting was also a significant element in my images. Bright and colourful lights would appeal to my audience as it is representational of my genre. It also plays a big part in terms of location. Most of my images were manipulated on Photoshop to give this effect, which I'll talk about in detail later. A mixture of images of both males and females will attract both genders. Stereotypically, the electronic music genre is mainly dominated by males. However, I challenged this by using a somewhat feminine colour scheme of bright pinks and purples, and using images of attractive males that would appeal to the female audience. I did not want my product to appear female-dominated, as this would result in my product being less appealing to males. To maintain a balance, I used images of attractive females in certain cover lines, such as SoundCloud Portable Release, that would appeal to males. The majority of my images aren't overly sexual in a way that would make them less appeal to a certain gender, which is effective in attracting both audiences. In terms of the content of my product, I made sure that my product had a heavy sense of prominence, as this is extremely significant in addressing my target audience. I did this with my promotional CD and through my cover lines. When writing about the CD on my contents page and the article in the double page spread, I adopted an informal style of writing that would be more relevant to a younger audience. When doing my market research, people agreed that a price of £4.20 would be the most appealing to them for a product that is released monthly. I used the software Adobe Photoshop not only to create the layout of my product, but also to manipulate various images into representing my target audience better. For example, the mise-en-scène in this image is somewhat representational of my target audience, and in terms of aesthetic qualities, it's decent. However, I thought that it wasn't vivid and interesting enough to be used in a conventional magazine, and I could add bright lights to the image that would represent my audience. I then took a picture of the infrared lights from the darkroom in the photography department, as I thought it would be an ideal background for my image. I used various photo manipulation skills such as layer masking and erasing the image in the foreground so that the image behind it appears. For this image, I used the same techniques, although I also used the gradient tool in various places so that the subject would look more in place, as opposed to superimposed onto the image, as the quality of the product as a whole would decrease if the image is supposed to look fake and unnatural. I also used the burn tool to make the makeup on the females appear heavier. This was a small adjustment that I thought would boost the appeal of the image slightly. I also used various other techniques to boost the detail of the images. For example, here I used a high-pass filter to boost the vividness of the fine details in this image. Because the quality of my camera wasn't high and media institutions tend to use professional equipment, I thought manipulating the images into appearing somewhat professional would be the next best thing. I also used different methods of adjusting the brightness and contrast of my product's images, such as using curves, levels, and brightness contrast options to make the images stand out a little more. Again, this makes the images look better as they appear less dull, more interesting, and somewhat more conventional. For the product CD cover, I researched into a camera technique that can transform lights into different shapes. I took the image with a very long shutter speed and I rotated the camera so that the lights would appear morphed and stretched. I then layered this image onto the product using Photoshop, although I wasn't happy with the red tones and as it wasn't consistent with the rest of the magazine. I then transformed the colours and tones on my images using the colour balance tool. This resulted in the CD cover looking like it fit onto the magazine cover. From doing my preliminary task, I felt that I've learnt more about how to represent and address a particular audience in order for my product to appeal to them. For example, in my preliminary task, I used images that weren't relevant to any of the content in the magazine, whereas for my final product, I carefully chose the images to fit around the representation of my target audience. Also, my ability to manipulate the images and cut them out has progressed significantly from when I did my preliminary task. I also progressed in terms of making a product more conventional as a whole. In my preliminary task, I used 4 different fonts for my front cover. I learned that existing media products stick to a minimum amount of different fonts to overcomplicating the products. I kept this in mind when creating my final product. I also learnt more about how to make the text stand out in order for the product to be more appealing. For example, here I used a blending option on Photoshop to make the headline stand out. This contrasts from my preliminary task, which appears dull and unappealing in terms of aesthetic qualities. I also learnt how to adjust small elements that help determine whether a product is conventional or not, such as putting the issue information in an institution's website on a solid background as opposed to layered on top of an image or another feature from when I produced my preliminary task. Overall, I've learnt that in order for a product to be successful in this industry, it needs to stand out as a genre and develop on existing conventions. I also have a better understanding on how planning makes a big impact on the result. By having initial ideas recorded, it allowed me to build on them while I created the project. Market research and setting up focus groups are significant in finding out how an institution can represent and target their target audience, which is something that I was lacking in my preliminary task.